Of the desperate battles fought in the skies over southern England during the summer of 1940, there was just one aircraft that could bear the weight of an entire nation's survival, and that aircraft wasn't the Spitfire. While the sleek, modern fighter captured headlines and public imagination, another machine, one built using techniques borrowed from 1920s biplanes, covered in Irish linen fabric, assembled with techniques already considered obsolete before it even entered service, quietly shouldered 60% of the killing work during Britain's finest hour. It was slower than its opponents, less maneuverable than its famous stablemate. Built with technology the Air Ministry had initially rejected as outdated, yet this supposedly inferior fighter destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other type during the Battle of Britain. This is the story of the Hawker Hurricane, an aircraft that, by every measure of modern engineering, should have failed. Instead, it saved a nation. In the early 1930s, RAF Fighter Command possessed precisely 13 squadrons. Their equipment consisted entirely of biplanes, the Hawker Fury, the Hawker Demon, the Bristol Bulldog. All featured fixed wooden propellers and non-retractable undercarriages. All were hopelessly inadequate for the coming war. Within the halls of the Air Ministry, an institutional prejudice existed against monoplane fighters. Senior staff believed the biplane represented the pinnacle of fighter design. Change was unwelcome. Innovation was viewed with suspicion. Sydney Camm didn't particularly care what they thought. Born in Windsor in 1893, Camm had joined the Hawker Engineering Company in 1922 and rapidly ascended to chief designer. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, his designs had equipped the RAF, the Hart, the Hind, the Fury, the Audax. All biplanes, all bearing his distinctive engineering signature, a Warren Truss steel tube fuselage structure that was both simple to manufacture and remarkably robust. But by 1933, Camm recognized that the age of the biplane was ending. In discussions with Major John Buchanan of the Air Ministry's Directorate of Technical Development and Squadron Leader Ralph Sawley of Operational Requirements, he began exploring a radical proposition, a monoplane derivative of the Fury. The Air Ministry's initial response was predictable. Camm's first formal proposal, the PV-3 submitted for specification FEF.7/30, was rejected outright. The ministry didn't bother ordering a prototype. Camm's response was to design something better. By January 1934, he'd produced detailed drawings for an entirely new fighter. It featured a cantilever monoplane wing, retractable undercarriage, and was to be powered not by the troublesome Rolls-Royce Goshawk engine, but by an entirely new design, the PV-12, which would later become legendary as the Merlin. The armament specification called for 4 machine guns, 2 in the wings, 2 in the fuselage, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc. Conventional, unambitious, already obsolete. Then in July 1934, everything changed. At a meeting chaired by Air Commodore Arthur Tedder, Captain F.W. Gunner Hill presented calculations that would fundamentally alter fighter design for the next decade. His conclusion was stark. Future fighters must carry no fewer than 8 machine guns, each capable of firing 1,000 rounds per minute. His assistant in making these calculations was his 13-year-old daughter, Hazel Hill. The reasoning was sound. German bombers were becoming larger, more robust, more heavily armed. To guarantee a kill during the brief seconds a fighter pilot might have an enemy in his sights, overwhelming firepower was essential. Squadron leader Sawley championed the concept. In November 1934, the Air Ministry issued specification .5/34, calling for fighters armed with 8 guns. Camm's design was too far advanced to immediately incorporate the change, but by January 1935, a wooden mock-up had been completed, and in August, the specification was amended. 8 guns, all mounted in the wings, a revolutionary armament for an aircraft still using construction techniques from the previous decade. In August 1935, work on the airframe was completed at Hawker's Kingston-upon-Thames facility. The components were transported to Brooklands, Surrey, where full assembly took place. On October 23, 1935, the prototype stood complete. On November 6, 1935, Hawker's chief test pilot, Flight Lieutenant George Bowman, took the prototype designated K5083 into the air for the first time. The flight trials that followed were conducted under severe restrictions. The Merlin engine hadn't yet achieved full flight certification. Numerous failures plagued the early tests, Yet the aircraft's fundamental characteristics proved sound. By March 1936, initial trials had demonstrated a maximum speed of 315 miles per hour at 16,200 feet. The climb to 15,000 feet required just 5.7 minutes. The stalling speed, using flaps, was a mere 57 miles per hour, only marginally higher than the Gladiator biplane it was intended to replace. There was, however, a problem. During spin recovery tests, the aircraft exhibited alarming characteristics. In certain conditions, all rudder authority could be lost. The Air Ministry refused to waive spinning tests. The Royal Aircraft Establishment eventually determined that the issue stemmed from airflow breakdown over the lower fuselage. The solution was elegantly simple: a small ventral fairing and an extended rudder bottom. The fix came too late for the first 60 production aircraft, but all subsequent machines incorporated the modification. In June 1936, the Air Ministry placed an order for 600 aircraft. On June 26, 1936, during an official visit by King Edward VIII to Martlesham Heath, the name was formally approved: Hurricane. The Hurricane's construction was, by contemporary standards, archaic. The primary fuselage structure consisted of a Warren Truss steel tube framework with duralumin cross-bracing, mechanically fastened, not welded. Over this skeleton, wooden formers and stringers were attached, then covered with doped Irish linen fabric. Only a section between the cockpit and engine cowling used lightweight metal panels. Sydney Camm had deliberately chosen traditional construction over advanced stress skin metal techniques. It was a decision many viewed as conservative, perhaps even timid. It would prove to be brilliant. The Hurricane was significantly cheaper to produce than the Spitfire. It required 10,300 man-hours per airframe compared to the Spitfire's 15,200. More importantly, it could be repaired under field conditions with basic equipment. Damage to the fabric covering could be patched with doped linen in hours. Even damage to the steel tube structure could be repaired by squadron ground crews without specialist facilities. The first production Hurricane flew on October 12, 1937, powered by a Merlin second engine, delivering 1,030 horsepower. By December 1937, the first 4 aircraft had entered service with number 111 Squadron at RAF Northolt. It was the first RAF production aircraft capable of exceeding 300 miles per hour in level flight. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the RAF possessed 18 Hurricane-equipped squadrons. Another 3,500 aircraft were on order. The Hurricane had arrived just in time. The question was whether it would be enough. On May 10, 1940, Germany launched Vollgelb, the invasion of France and the Low Countries. Within days, Hurricane units of the air component attached to the British Expeditionary Force were suffering catastrophic losses. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command, resisted intense pressure to commit more squadrons to France. He understood what politicians did not. Britain's survival depended on preserving fighters for home defense. A compromise was reached. 8 half squadrons were deployed to France as reinforcements. On May 17, 1940, Pilot Officer Wilf Sizer's B flight of 213 Squadron 8 Hurricanes landed at Merville. The young pilot, who had only recently transitioned from the Gauntlet biplane, was immediately thrust into combat. The experience was harrowing. German formations appeared with clockwork regularity. The Luftwaffe possessed air superiority. Hurricane pilots flew sortie after sortie, often outnumbered, frequently exhausted. Within weeks, France fell. The Hurricane squadrons that survived withdrew to Britain. Many pilots had been killed. Aircraft losses were severe, but the experience gained over France would prove invaluable for what came next. On July 10, 1940, the Luftwaffe began sustained attacks against British shipping in the English Channel. By August, the attacks shifted to RAF airfields. The Battle of Britain had begun. Fighter Command entered the battle with 32 Hurricane squadrons and 19 Spitfire squadrons. The disparity was significant. The Hurricane was more numerous because it was easier to produce, easier to maintain, and despite its dated construction, extremely effective. The tactical deployment evolved rapidly. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commanding number 11 Group, which defended London and the southeast, recognized that the Hurricane and Spitfire possessed different strengths. The Spitfire was faster, more maneuverable, better suited to engaging Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters on equal terms. The Hurricane, by contrast, was a supremely stable gun platform. Its wide-track undercarriage made landing straightforward even for exhausted pilots. Its 8 Browning .303 machine guns concentrated in the wings delivered devastating firepower, and its rugged construction meant battle damage that would ground a Spitfire could often be repaired overnight. Park strategy became standard. Spitfires engaged the fighter escorts. Hurricanes attacked the bombers. It was unglamorous work. Bomber interception required flying directly into formations of heavily armed Heinkel 111S, Dornier 17S, and Junkers 88S. German gunners poured defensive fire at approaching fighters. Many Hurricane pilots were wounded or killed in these attacks. But the Hurricane excelled at destroying bombers. Its stable flying characteristics allowed precise aiming. Its 8 machine guns could shred bombers' control surfaces, puncture fuel tanks, kill crew members. Pilot after pilot reported the Hurricane's docility during gun attacks. Roland Beaumont, who flew Hurricanes during the Battle of Britain, later described the aircraft. There was no sudden surge of acceleration, but with a thunderous roar from the exhaust just ahead on either side of the windscreen, only a steady increase in speed. The Hurricane had all the qualities of its stable, secure biplane predecessor, the Hart, but enhanced by livelier controls, greater precision. However, the Hurricane wasn't without serious disadvantages when facing German fighters. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was faster in level flight and could outdive the Hurricane. Both the Hurricane and Spitfire suffered from a critical weakness inherited from the Merlin engine, a float-type carburetor that would flood during negative G maneuvers. If a Hurricane attempted to follow a BRF 109 into a negative G dive, the engine would cough, splutter, and potentially cut out entirely. The German fighter, equipped with a fuel-injected Daimler-Benz engine, had no such limitation. The problem wasn't fully solved during the Battle of Britain, though an extremely clever engineer named Beatrice Tilly-Schilling devised a partial solution, a flow restrictor that somewhat alleviated the fuel flooding issue. Pilots referred to it as Miss Schilling's orifice. It helped, but didn't eliminate the problem. Hurricane pilots learned to roll inverted before diving to maintain positive G-forces. It cost precious seconds that could mean life or death. Despite its limitations against Bf 109S in pure dogfighting, the Hurricane's strengths were undeniable. It could outturn the Bf 109, its rate of roll was excellent, and its ability to absorb battle damage was legendary. The fabric covering proved unexpectedly advantageous. Explosive cannon shells from German fighters sometimes passed through the fabric without detonating. Bullets that would cause catastrophic structural damage to a stressed skin metal aircraft merely required a patch of doped linen. But the Hurricane had one terrifying vulnerability. Directly ahead of the cockpit sat a large saddle tank containing 100-octane aviation fuel. If an incendiary round struck this tank, the fuel ignited instantly. The pilot had 2 choices: remain in the burning aircraft and die, or open the canopy and attempt to escape, exposing himself to a 300-mile-per-hour blast furnace. Many Hurricane pilots suffered horrific burns. The plastic surgeon Archibald Mackindo became renowned for treating these men at Queen Victoria Hospital in East Grinstead. The pilots he reconstructed referred to themselves as the Guinea Pig Club. One of the most extraordinary acts of courage during the Battle of Britain involved this exact scenario. On August 16, 1940, Flight Lieutenant James Nicholson of 249 Squadron was leading a patrol when Bf 109S attacked his flight from above. 4 cannon shells struck Nicholson's Hurricane, 1 severed the engine's gravity fuel tank feed, 1 shattered the canopy, 1 struck the engine, igniting fuel and hydraulic fluid, 1 penetrated the cockpit, wounding Nicholson's left foot. The cockpit erupted in flames. Nicholson released his harness and began climbing out. At that moment, a Bf 109 flew directly across his nose. Nicholson, already badly burned, dropped back into the inferno, grasped the control column, aligned his sights, and fired. The Bf 109 staggered, rolled, and went down. Only then did Nicholson bail out. He was badly burned on his hands, face, neck, and legs. His parachute descent took several minutes. A member of the Home Guard, mistaking him for a German, shot him through the buttocks before realizing the error. Nicholson survived. He was awarded the Victoria Cross, the only fighter command pilot to receive Britain's highest decoration for valor during the entire war. By the end of October 1940, the Battle of Britain was over. Germany had failed to achieve air superiority. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, was indefinitely postponed. The statistics were unambiguous. Of the 2,698 enemy aircraft destroyed by Fighter Command during the battle, Hurricanes were credited with approximately 1,593, nearly 60% of all kills. The Hurricane, not the Spitfire, had won the Battle of Britain, but the Hurricane's war was far from over. By 1941, the Hurricane's performance as a pure fighter was declining. Newer German fighters like the Bf 109F outclassed it in speed, climb rate, and altitude performance. The Hurricane's days as a frontline interceptor in Northwest Europe were ending. Instead, the Hurricane evolved, and in doing so, it found new purpose in every theater of the war. The Hurricane Mark II, introduced in 1940, featured the more powerful Merlin-Tuppence engine, producing 1,480 horsepower. The Mark I Tie A retained 8.303 machine guns. The Mark I Tie A upgraded to 12.303S. The Mark I Tie S, perhaps the most significant variant, replaced machine guns with 420 mm Hispano cannons, devastating weapons against ground targets. The Hurricane Mark IV became a dedicated ground attack aircraft capable of carrying bombs or 8 RP-3 rocket projectiles, the same weapons used by Typhoons against German armor. In North Africa, Hurricane fighter bombers wreaked havoc on Axis supply columns, airfields, and troop concentrations. In Malta, Hurricanes defended the besieged island against relentless Italian and German bombing. In Russia, over 3,000 Hurricanes were supplied to the Soviet air forces under Lend-Lease, serving on the brutal Eastern Front. In Burma, Hurricanes flew ground attack missions until the end of the war, supporting the 14th Army's advance through appalling jungle conditions. Perhaps the most desperate use of the Hurricane was aboard merchant convoys. To defend Atlantic convoys from long-range German FW-200 Condor maritime patrol bombers, a solution was devised that bordered on suicidal. Hurricanes were fitted with catapult attachments and mounted aboard Camm ships, catapult-armed merchantmen. When a Condor appeared, the Hurricane would be blasted off the catapult by a rocket-propelled sled. The pilot's mission was to shoot down the Condor. Then, if within range of land, he would fly toward Britain and attempt to reach an airfield. If beyond range, he would ditch in the freezing North Atlantic and hope the convoy could rescue him before he died of hypothermia. It was a one-way trip. The Hurricane couldn't return to the merchant ship. There was no aircraft carrier to land on. Several pilots successfully completed this mission and survived. Others weren't so fortunate. Later, a modified version, the Sea Hurricane, was developed for fleet carriers, equipped with an arrestor hook and catapult attachment points. These aircraft served aboard Royal Navy carriers in the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and during the Arctic convoys to Russia. The Hurricane fought in every major theater. It served with the air forces of Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Belgium, Poland, Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union, Finland, Ireland, Persia, Turkey, and Egypt. By the time production ended in July 1944, 14,487 Hurricanes had been completed in Britain and Canada. It was one of the most produced British aircraft of the war. The last Hurricane, serial number PZ-865, rolled off the production line at Hawker's Langley facility in July 1944. By that time, newer fighters like the Tempest and the Spitfire Mark XIV had assumed frontline duties. The Hurricane's combat career was over, but its legacy was just beginning. In the decades since the war, the Hurricane has been somewhat overshadowed by its famous stablemate. The Spitfire captured the public imagination. It was beautiful, graceful, modern. It appeared in films, on posters, in the collective memory of a generation. The Hurricane, by contrast, was workmanlike, practical, unglamorous. It lacked the Spitfire's aesthetic elegance. Its construction methods were outdated before it entered service. By 1942, its performance was obsolete against the latest German fighters. Yet the Hurricane achieved something the Spitfire never could. It bore the weight of the most critical air battle in history and emerged victorious. The reasons for its success were precisely those that made it seem inferior. Its dated construction meant squadrons could repair battle damage in the field. Its stable handling made it an ideal gun platform for bomber interception. Its wide-track undercarriage reduced landing accidents. Its fabric covering made it surprisingly resilient to battle damage. Sydney Camm's conservative design choices, criticized by some as unambitious, proved to be exactly what Britain needed in 1940. Camm himself continued designing for Hawker throughout and after the war. He was responsible for the Typhoon and Tempest fighters, the magnificent Hawker Hunter jet, and contributed to the early development of the Harrier jump jet. He was knighted in 1953 for his contributions to British aviation. He passed away in 1966, leaving behind a legacy few aircraft designers could match. Of the 14,487 Hurricanes built, only a handful survive today. Approximately 12 to 14 are airworthy worldwide. Several others are preserved in museums, silent witnesses to a desperate time. The most famous surviving Hurricane is R4118, the only airworthy aircraft to have actually fought in the Battle of Britain. This aircraft, now operated by the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, serves as a living memorial to the pilots who flew and fought in hurricanes during the summer of 1940. Common myths persist about the Hurricane. Some claim it was merely a stopgap, an inferior substitute kept in service only because Britain lacked sufficient Spitfires. This is demonstrably false. The Hurricane was specifically deployed against bombers because it excelled in that role. Its kill ratio against bombers was higher than the Spitfires. Others suggest the Hurricane was obsolete by 1940. Yet it remained in frontline service in multiple theaters until 1944. Its evolution into an effective ground attack aircraft proved its adaptability. The Hurricane's true legacy lies not in performance statistics or technical specifications, but in what it achieved at Britain's most desperate hour. In the summer of 1940, when Nazi Germany controlled continental Europe from Norway to the Pyrenees, when invasion barges assembled in French ports, when the Luftwaffe launched wave after wave of bombers against British cities, it was the Hurricane, that fabric-covered, outdated, supposedly inferior fighter, that held the line. 60% of all enemy aircraft destroyed during the Battle of Britain fell to Hurricane guns. 32 squadrons flew the type during the battle. Pilots like Nicholson, like Sizer, like hundreds of others climbed into their Hurricanes day after day, facing impossible odds, and prevailed. The Hurricane was built using techniques borrowed from 1920s biplanes. It was slower than its opponents, less glamorous than its stablemate, considered obsolete by experts before it even entered service. By every rational measure, it should have failed. Instead, it saved civilization. That is the Hurricane's legacy. That is why, 80 years later, we remember, not because it was the best fighter of the war, but because when it mattered most, it was exactly the fighter Britain needed.